All right, welcome back. Hopefully, the 14th time's the charm. Let's get started. So, today we are going to take a look at the 1960s. It was a time of promise and turmoil. 1960, the decade starts with the presidential election, right? We have two candidates. We have Richard Nixon, who is 47 years old at this time. He is coming off of an 8-year stint as the vice president under Eisenhower. He's known as a pretty tough statesman. He had actually gotten into a debate called the kitchen debate with Khrushchev because they were in a model kitchen when this debate happened about the merits of communism versus capitalism. He was unanimously nominated by the Republican Party for the candidacy. He is versing the first Catholic candidate since 1928, John F. Kennedy. He is 43 years old, and he won barely enough delegates in order to win the nomination for the Democratic Party. He chooses LBJ, or Lyndon B. Johnson, as his running mate, who's from Texas, right? So he's from the East. He chooses this Texan, which looks better for him. However, he's still not really able to capture the rural Protestants like Nixon was. This is the first time that presidential candidates debate on television on this new medium, which we've talked about, right? So remember, by 1961, there were something like 3.3 televisions for every household, right? So there were or every person in the household, I don't know, it was a lot. There were a lot of televisions. So this new medium is used for the first time during this presidential debate. Nixon does not look comfortable at all. He is stammering, he's sweating. On the other hand, we have John F. Kennedy, who is an absolute natural at the television and televised debates, right? So we see that this is one of the closest presidential elections in US history. Kennedy wins by just over 100,000 votes, and it was so close that, of course, the Republicans are accusing the Democrats of ballot stuffing, right, or stuffing ballot boxes, and basically stealing the election. Kennedy does win 303 of the electoral votes, and he is inaugurated as president. Heard me. This is John F. Kennedy right here on the right, and his wife, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. They are arguably a pretty good-looking couple, right? They're fairly young to be in office. There's LBJ right there, Lyndon B. Johnson. And they are, pretty stylish. They have an appreciation of the arts, right? And the press really likens Kennedy's presidency to Camelot, which is, the mythical court of King Arthur. It was a very popular Broadway musical at the time. And so there's this kind of hopefulness that takes over the United States because we have this young, kind of energetic couple that is essentially in office, right? Obviously, JFK is the president, but Jackie did a lot of stuff as well. So during Kennedy's inaugural speech, he promises a new frontier. And this looks like, federal aid for education, for healthcare, for urban renewal, right? Remember that white flight out of cities, as well as civil rights activities and amendments, right? He does not get a whole lot of support from Congress. He is also, most of his proposals do become realities after his administration is over, right? During Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. In 1962, I believe it was for Rice University, he makes the speech, at the end of the school year. This becomes known as the Moon Speech. And he basically promises that the United States is going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. This means that basically NASA only has about 8 years to make this happen. They get it done in just about 7, right? So it does kick off this increased spending, however, on defense and space, right? So in NASA as well. He also is able to implement some tax cuts, right? But it does stimulate the economy, so the economy does get better when Kennedy is in office. All right, so let's take a look at some of his foreign policies. So in 1961, Kennedy does set up the Peace Corps, and this is an organization that gives aid to developing nations. Still exists, right? Mainly younger kids that are either in college or just out of college are part of the Peace Corps. I don't know if they have an age limit. I believe they used to, but that might not be the case anymore. He also sets up the Alliances for Progress in 1961, right? And so this promotes land reform and economic development in Latin America. He also, in 1962, passes the Trade Expansion Act, which authorizes tariff reductions with the recently formed European Economic Community, also known as the Common Market. This is the forerunner of the EU, or the European Union that exists today. In 1961, Kennedy approves the CIA sponsored overthrow, right, of Castro, using exiled Cubans, so people that were thrown out of Cuba, rather. Geez, oh Pete's. They end up getting trapped on the beach, and Kennedy was like, I'm not sending you help. You guys told me that this was going to be kind of a real easy operation, and it's not. So all of those Cuban exiles did end up having to surrender on the beach, right? As a result of this, however, Castro uses it to get more aid from the Soviet Union or the USSR. The same, I guess, year, right, and Khrushchev and Kennedy meet in Vienna in 1961, and Khrushchev basically demands that the U.S. leave or pull out of Berlin. Kennedy's like, nah, man, we're good. So Khrushchev basically ends up building a wall, right, known as the Berlin Wall. And the purpose of the wall was to keep East Germans, so people under communist control, from fleeing to West Berlin or West Germany, where it would be, a capitalist free society. Kennedy does go back to Berlin goes to Berlin rather in 1963, and he makes this really famous speech. It is linked there. I can't get the link to work while I'm recording, unfortunately. But essentially, he says this: freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. As a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. I probably murdered that, but basically he's saying I am a Berliner, right? Of course, I think I've touched on a little bit, the wall did come down in 1989. It kind of sparked the end of communism in a lot of people's eyes. So we move on to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the US discovers that the Soviets are building underground launch sites in Cuba. And so Kennedy's like, oh, no, man, I thought we were good. So he sets up a blockade, right, until essentially these are removed. It is very tense in the United States and around the world for a few days because nobody really knows if this is going to set off World War III or not. This could end up as a full-scale nuclear war. It was very nerve-wracking for a lot of people. Khrushchev finally agrees to take these underground sites out and remove the weapons, as long as the U.S. promises that they will not invade Cuba anymore, and we will remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a couple of things do happen. Number one, there is a telecommunication line that is set up directly between the US president and whoever is in charge of the USSR. At this point, it's Khrushchev, right? There are 100 different countries that sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which basically says that they will no longer test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. And the third thing that happens is we see this arms race for missile and warheads rather than nuclear options, right? So more like non-nuclear arms race and kind of, I guess, a traditional arms race as opposed to nuclear mutually assured destruction. There's also a flexible response that is in place, right? So we see this increase in spending mainly because of what becomes known as these brush fire wars or these proxy wars that take place in Asia, Southeast Asia, as well as Africa, that are funded and aided and trained by the Soviets. The US response and Kennedy's response to this is to develop elite forces in order to undermine any authority that the USSR might have, and as well as negotiate and kind of train our own people as well, right? So think about like the Green Berets and other elite forces. They would have been much more popular in the 1960s. All right. So Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas in November of 1963. He is shot in Dallas, Texas. 2 bullets, right? There's been, a lot of question about whether there were 2 shooters or not. Supposed assassin was killed 2 days later. That was Lee Harvey Oswald. The Warren Commission is set up, and they concluded that he was the only assassin. However, there are still doubts to the credibility of the government, whether or not they are keeping that secret or not, because this assassination was televised and it was very traumatizing for a lot of people. Literally any boomer or anybody of that age that was alive in 1963 that is American, usually they know exactly where they were when Kennedy was shot. It was that big of a deal. So if we're looking at this image now, we are seeing that JFK is in the autocade. It is very disturbing. I'm not going to show the video to you guys because it's just that disturbing. But this, they're driving to the end of Innocence, right? The end of Camelot, if you will. Jackie O is right here. Kennedy is here. Shortly after, we imagine that Kennedy is shot and basically, the traumatizing image of Jackie O kind of like collecting his brain matter. Again, really disturbing. So within about 2 hours after Kennedy was assassinated, we see here Lyndon B. Johnson, and again, there's Jackie O. You can't really tell, but there are blood stains on her coat right here. This is Air Force One, and he is inaugurated as, or sworn in as president, right? So Kennedy, I guess his legacy would be best kind of described by this famous quote from him, right? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, right? And so it had kind of like planted the seed, especially in younger Americans, that they could effectively change the world. So we get to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, or the zenith of liberalism. All right, so we are going to be taking a look at this essential question for this little portion. To what extent were efforts to use federal power to end racial discrimination, eliminate poverty, and address other social issues while attacking communism abroad effective? Well, if we're looking at this chart, we can see that the poverty rates do decline pretty drastically. In the 1960s, right? We have 1960 is the election, probably by like 63-ish, 64-ish, it drops off pretty quickly, right? Here's another chart that kind of talks about the poverty in the United States, again, we're looking at the 1950s where we have roughly 32% that live in poverty, as opposed to 2011, 2013 right here, where we hold steady usually at about a 15% rate. The idea of the Great Society that Lyndon B. Johnson takes office on is that this would be the predicted poverty rate, that by 2013 we would be at less than 5% if everything had taken hold, if everything, remained as the status quo or ceteris paribus, right? All things being equal. All right. So, as mentioned, Lyndon B. Johnson is a Democrat from Texas. His goal was to basically expand on the New Deal. He loved FDR, right? He wanted to push through what Kennedy was running on as well, his New Frontier, and so pretty quickly he persuades Congress to pass an expanded version of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. He also is able to push through an income tax cut. And of course, this sparks the economy because it means that there's more money in people's pockets, right? So you have an increase in consumer spending and economic expansion. Of course, part of that economic expansion was because of things that Kennedy had said and done during his time in office. So again, we see that LBJ is just building on that momentum. He starts his war on poverty, right, pretty quickly on. So he has the creation of the Office of Economic Opportunity, or the OEO, that he starts in 1964. He gives $1 billion worth of spending or a budget to this organization, right, or this office. Most of what is being able to be accomplished during this time period does end up kind of getting cut back during the Vietnam War. But he is able to start the Head Start program for preschoolers, which is still in existence, at least for a little while longer. The Job Corps training, right, for basically giving people training, literacy, and legal services, right, to kind of help them to get out of poverty. He also starts community action programs where he believes that people in the neighborhood should be the ones that are running the programs because they know who actually need the programs, if that makes sense. However, there were some costs, right? So, yes, he expands what becomes known as kind of the welfare state, which during the next election cycle is part of who the other person ran against, right? But it does reduce the number of people and children, especially living in poverty, which is seen as a good thing. All right, so the election of 1964 is Lyndon B. Johnson versus Goldwater. Johnson runs on the idea of expansion of his welfare state, right? And of course, Goldwater, being a Republican, wants to end the welfare state. He wants to cut public spending, right? So we see for the first time that there's an impact of campaign ads, either for or against. But clearly, Johnson is doing something right if we look at these election results. He wins 61% of the popular vote, which is an insane amount. It is a landslide, right? And he wins roughly 90% of the electoral vote, if you're looking up here. Literally, Goldwater only held 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states. That's not a whole lot, right? And so we see this Democratic sweep of Congress as well. They are able to hold a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate, right? And so they are in this position to pass all of this legislation that had kind of been waiting around since the 1940s, since Truman's administration, right? And you could even argue since FDR's, but mainly Truman wanted to pass a lot of sweeping reforms, right? for his square deal, remember. So we have the New Deal under FDR, we have the Square Deal under Truman, and now we have the Great Society under LBJ. All right, so he does, again, make a ton of reforms. So he makes the Food Stamp Act in 1964, which provides, at this point, you could get things like government cheese, you could get milk, you could get bread and eggs, things that were subsidized by farmers and the federal government to help out not only farmers, but also people that were living in poverty to get those basic needs. Medicare and Medicaid is kind of the first step towards national health insurance, right? That Truman wanted. And you get the Child Nutrition Act of 1966, which basically pushes through, there used to be like a food pyramid, right? Now I think it's a plate. I'm not 100% on that. But basically making sure that school lunches and places that were run by the government were providing healthy meals to children. You also get the abolishment of the immigration quotas that have been around since the 1920s. So, and some of them before that, right? So that 1% rule cut out 1965, which becomes a good thing, especially after the Vietnam War, when we have a lot of Vietnamese that are trying to escape the Vietnam War in Vietnam and come to the United States for kind of starting over, right? You also get the expansion of 2 new cabinet departments. You get the Department of Transportation, which under that you could kind of argue that the Highway Beautification Act and the Beautify America are both kind of under that Department of Transportation. Pardon me. And you also get the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. This is for those inner cities, right? And also to provide housing for low-income people. All right. So, here we go. So obviously, you know, these were clearly pretty liberal policies that were able to be pushed through, right? And so the whole idea is that it should be the government that takes care of its citizens, right? There should be not necessarily a welfare state, but there should be some accountability of the government to take care of the citizens, especially those that are not able to kind of provide for themselves, either through lack of education, lack of, literacy, lack of resources. So you see that there are a lot of previously ignored groups like the poor, the disabled, and the elderly that are being recognized as being part of society, and the necessity to help those that are less fortunate in society come to at least a better standard of living, if nothing else, right? On the other side, of course, you have the conservative perspective, which is to tax and spend, right? They look at this as the birth of the modern welfare state, where basically you are making people lazy by helping them out. And you get the idea that the government is too big, right? So this has kind of been what we're starting to look at the two parties, as far as the Democrats and the Republicans, as very similar in values as what they are today. So again, Republicans typically, not always, but typically do want to cut government spending. They want to cut programs, right, as we're seeing right now in office. And Democrats typically want to expand on on the welfare of people, right? And they do typically want to expand on government programs to do that. So again, we're seeing that there is that duality, again, that Washington warned us against, right? All right, that is it for right now. I gotta take a break, y'all.